Freedom of speech, the hot topic of the 2010s. In a world where various governments have steadily been eroding the legal right to say things, it's worth going through why this right is so important, but also worth exploring the fact that the term free speech is so multifarious in its twisting, winding definitions. Certainly, the legality of all speech is quite clear, and is easily enforceable when understood in this form. But when people use the term free speech, they often use it in a way that implies some private right to be heard at all times, or to be properly understood, and to have the best platform possible for their ideas whenever they want. We've seen people argue that interrupting speakers on stage is a part of free speech.
Future generations will look back.
One more disruption and we'd have to ask you to leave the venue.
My free speech!
No, they're not. You have to obey the rules of the venue.
But this is free speech if you're so concerned!
Not free speech!
Yes, it is!
Or that having your arguments misrepresented is a form of censorship, which is then ipso facto a violation of free speech. There seems to be a boundless social definition of free being used, rather than a contextual legalistic one that defines the subject's relation to the government on the issue of expression, although I do not think that is the only viable interpretation of free speech. So in this video I'm going to first make the case for free speech as legal speech, and then address various alternative forms or extensions to this concept of free speech, in a way that tries to untangle all of the muddled notions of the concept with the aim of creating some loose guidelines in regards to censorship. Be forewarned that I will be repeating myself until you want to throw up. Freedom of speech in its legal manifestation should be interpreted as the legal right to say anything in of the words themselves without being fined or arrested or otherwise penalised by the government. This distinction between cultural norms and clearly laid down laws is sharp enough to let a legal conception of free speech be a coherent one. This can also be interpreted as being a negative rights formulation of the concept, where there is a duty not to infringe on the right rather than a duty to provide it. We already have an example of such a legal concept in the First Amendment of the Constitution of the United States. Other developed countries meanwhile have slipped into such a state that they have things such as hate speech laws. Many people out there support the more European consensus on speech and say that the American absolutist concept of free speech is one that allows the forces of bigotry and oppression to spread their poisonous words. They may even twist language and claim that they are for free speech but not hate speech, as hate speech stifles other forms of speech by making minorities afraid to fight their case, and here they are delving into a positive rights concept of speech. This argument is worth addressing. First of all, we need to consider whether European hate speech laws have been truly effective in tamping down the far right, and I think we can see that the movements of the far right are as much on the rise in Europe as in America. Furthermore, the cracking down on speech tends to be unidirectional and driven by progressive ideology. That's not to say that certain reactionary forces wouldn't also like to be able to police people's words, as they have done in the past whenever they had the power, but that the current paradigm on cultural issues is to do with offensiveness, multiculturalism and diversity, and this is a progressive paradigm. This is so much so the cultural paradigm that parties like the UK's Conservative Party are full in with their support of the progressive line on these issues, even if they distinguish themselves elsewhere. They see diversity as being good in of itself.
So the truth is, if we're going to build that strong, vibrant and inclusive society, we need more role models like this. Many more Muslim men and women at the top of British businesses, many more Muslim soldiers in the highest level of command, and of course more Muslims in our parliament. So there's not just one Muslim in the cabinet and one in the shadow cabinet, but British Muslims all across government in positions of leadership and authority.
In such an environment, the far right appears more novel and exotic than it actually is. The forbidden always holds a certain attraction. However, what appears not to be forbidden is hate speech by Muslims towards non-believers in their faith. The unidirectional, or near enough unidirectional nature of modern hate speech is dictated by a particular ideology. And that's an important point. When you make a law forbidding certain speech, you are forgoing state neutrality on the issue, and empowering a particular ideology to be able to dictate the terms of debate. This will give that ideology a tremendous advantage, or at least in the short term, before those locked on the outside tear the whole system down. No ideology should be safe from criticism. Some might respond that hate speech actually represents a consensus by all of the sane ideologies against the radical lunatic fringe, But the problem with this is that the reason we know the radical lunatics are radical lunatics is through the demonstration of that, and there's no way to close the case completely and say that the debate is settled, because you're asking each new generation to take these words for granted. I'm sorry, but you really do need to have the same conversation each time. Also, the definition of what is radical currently is being measured against an establishment paradigm that itself would be considered radical in previous times. And I indeed consider many of the things which are taken for granted today to be very radical. Even in the case of something like Nazism or communism or other radical ideologies, if they are 99% bad, there might be a 1% grain of truth even in an ideology that when added all together is genocidal. We of course want to be as much the opposite of those ideologies as we possibly can be, and we of course don't want to accept their explicit claims. But what if we reject even those claims on which they are correct due to the negative association with the ideology as a whole? What if that 1% grain of truth was left out of the allowed consensus? Things would truck along fine most of the time, until the point of crisis when that grain of truth finally becomes relevant. Then by insisting that if the radicals say the sky is blue it is actually green, we open ourselves up to an underground conspiracy against us that argues that we are engaging in the big lie. If we aren't willing to address the truth regardless of who else might agree with us, then people will begin to wonder what else we are lying about, and this is how conspiracies spread. A direct example of this would be that coming out against cultural relativism and universalism is considered taboo in establishment political circles. A belief that everyone everywhere is a nascent Western liberal just waiting to be freed from oppression led to disastrous consequences in the ill-fated wars in Iraq and Afghanistan. The neoconservative ideology assumed that they would be greeted as liberators, because to think that an entire culture could be alien right down to its roots was something outside of the Overton window. The very truth of the matter was outside the Overton window, and so the belief was that all that had to be done was the removal of the brutal elites, and then the Western model of liberal democracy would spontaneously flower amidst the ashes. Instead, the result was the flowering of nascent radical Islam. We would see this pattern repeat during the Arab Spring, where the media were blindsided by the rise of the Muslim Brotherhood as a consequence of Arab democracy, and in the end the army staged a coup and essentially returned the status quo. We were blindsided in Libya and made the same mistake as in Iraq. Now Libya is a hotbed for slavers, and its collapse was a major vector for the migrant crisis, along with the war in Syria. In our rush to be opposite evil to the greatest degree we possibly could be, we excluded certain possibilities from the table entirely, and we have, ironically, made fertile ground for that very same evil. A truly liberal paradigm can incorporate truths from the far right and far left, without enacting their ideologies, and at certain points of crisis, if it refuses to do so, it will be undercut by those very same ideologies. It's as simple as that. Call that liberalism's black pill, but there it is. It may be that the marketplace of ideas is not a truly rational and efficient market, but the answer to this is clearly not a monopoly on truth. Such a thing cannot survive in the long term, as no one is 100% correct, and when that 1% or 0.1% becomes relevant and you refuse to address it, you open space for all the lies in the world, and that's even assuming that the current paradigm is mostly correct, and I would cast some doubts on that. All the perils of freedom are better than the catastrophic alternative. Will people ever learn how to think? Another reason I fully support legal speech is that I consider the radicals to be my canaries in the coal mine. If they are being censored, I might be next. And unfortunately, people who are on my level are actually being attacked right now. Consider that people like Sargon of Akkad are being accused of being members of the alt-right at the moment. The false accusation of fascism thrown around so often means I don't want the accusers anywhere near the position where they get to decide what speech will get you fined or thrown in jail. We won't even be 50% correct in that case. Another reason to oppose government censorship is that if you decide to censor, you set a precedent for your enemies to censor you. Not only on a psychological or game theory level, but in terms of court precedent. And then when an administration changes, it's your turn for punishment. As I've mentioned, the model I look to for fighting back against state censorship is the US one, and although it isn't perfect, it's seen them do a lot better than the rest of us. Of course, the First Amendment only covers the legal apparatus, and doesn't say anything about censorship by various platforms within society. Indeed, one of the reasons the First Amendment can function in the fashion it does is because it follows a negative rights reasoning on speech. The First Amendment essentially allows anything to be said anywhere in the United States, as the government will not use its legal monopoly to tamp down on any private entities that platform such speech. However, it would be much more tricky to say that anything can be said anywhere, because that would require a positive right to any particular platform. This would mean that any entity that does not platform you is de facto censoring you. Censorship understood in this sense is totally and completely inevitable, and if we are to avoid muddled thinking, we shouldn't make an absolute stand for a positive rights interpretation of speech. Various things I've seen interpreted as violations of free speech, or at least forms of censorship, include blocking people on Twitter, not platforming people, not being allowed to speak over speakers at a conference, and even misrepresentation of someone's arguments. These interpretations of free speech are self-detonating and render free speech a joke. By muddling the concept, they actually sap support for a functional legal interpretation. This being said, there are some things to consider on the issue of censorship by sub-legal platforms. What about when platforms, public or private, become either so big or so impactful on the populace that the censorship regimes they enact push certain ideas to the fringe? Although we can't apply a First Amendment fundamentalist interpretation to anything less than the legal order, and completely eradicate censorship in the wider sphere, as we'd be risking freedom of association at the same time, we can perhaps construct some good cultural guidelines. So the next topic to discuss is private censorship, although you will see that we should really say platform-level censorship, and not merely private censorship, because regardless of whether something like Facebook was private or owned by the government, it would still need to be able to manipulate and manage speech in order to even function as a social network in the first place, where people can talk about things without endless spam getting in the way. The issue then is more about narrowing the scope of these actions and eliminating bias towards certain explicit ideologies, rather than some utopian absolute elimination of censorship outside of its legal sense. Nonetheless, we will firstly consider the private distinction, as it is an important one. Private property allows for every separate interest to potentially have representation, and for free association to exist effectively. The state delegates title to land and means of production to citizens, and with this title, it is possible for different spaces for different interests and different people to coexist in the same larger society. This is both a productive engine and an ethical solution to the problem of competing interests fighting over the same state. Private property title means control over that property, and this naturally means de facto control over speech within the bounds of that property. If I own my house, or have some deferred rights to it, then if I don't want someone in there, I can legally have the police remove them, and naturally by default, this abridges their ability to express themselves within my home, by dint of abridging their ability to be present in my home. Now, private property title has some limitations in our society, and various kinds of businesses are held to different standards than a private home. However, even if there are some rules preventing McDonald's from, say, discriminating against customers on the basis of various protected characteristics, the duty of McDonald's to effectively platform someone is not infinite. And so, if you go into a fast food chain and start soapboxing about the reptilian conspiracy, then they have the legal right to have you removed from the premises. Naturally then, the very nature of property and the control by its owners limits its usage for non-owners. It kind of has to in order for society to function. If a card game club wishes to use its property for the purpose of card games, people who want to do karate can't barge in and demand their right to the same space at the same time. You can't platform everyone on the same platform at the same time, and if one platform is optimised for one purpose rather than another, then that is only to the betterment of society. This sort of freedom of association is a good thing, and something we need more of, not less of. So the upside is that we can avoid the zero-sum competition that would be created in a society operated as a single entity, and we can promote choice and free association. But the downside, at least on the margins of the issue, is that without action, property itself can grow to become state-like and monopolistic, and take all of that freedom away, which is what we see with today's megacorps, internet-based or otherwise, but especially in the case of the internet. The problem is one of scale, and this makes it difficult to come to a completely objective conclusion, because then you have to decide how big something is before an equivalent to the First Amendment should apply to its internal operations. At least with the traditional First Amendment, we have a clear formal distinction between the legal system and private property. The larger problem, of course, is that, as I was alluding to earlier, even if a platform is government-run, a well-functioning platform is going to require some kind of hierarchy or authority, and that necessarily means that de facto forms of censorship will occur. So I don't think that the proposal to apply the First Amendment to private entities has been fully thought out, since the legal concept of free speech can only function in an absolutist way when it is applied to society as a whole, and not any particular platform within society, regardless of whether it is public or private. So as previously established, the problem is bigger than private versus public, at least when we consider free speech in the absolutist sense a lot of the anti-SJW activists want to view it in. Free speech can be absolutist, and should be, if it applies to society as a whole, as a legal principle that the government will not create any laws abridging speech. But it cannot be absolutist if it is applied to platforms within society, regardless of whether they are run by the government or not. And you can make all sorts of rulings saying that something that is to do with the law will now apply to the organisations, but these rulings won't be effective, because what they are calling for would be non-functional. This does not, however, mean that we can't view platform-level free speech in a relative sense, and in the relative sense in which we allow for contradictions, we can say that we want more free speech than what we currently have, and we can look into the implications of that shortly. For now, let's consider the fact that free speech must be considered in a relative fashion on the platform level. If a platform chooses to, platform someone, then great. Or perhaps not. What if they platform someone with crazy reactionary politics? What then? Well, I guess people can use their own free speech to provide social pressure to lead to deplatforming. They have that right. But what if they are intimidating or threaten violence? Sometimes they do use violence, and then I think the police should rather obviously come in and crack their heads because it's not speech anymore. But other times people get pretty close with their implicit threats without going ahead with anything. Where do you draw the line? You can't draw the line if you want to have absolute legal freedom of speech, as I do. All you can do is in turn use social pressure against those deplatforming the people you want platformed. And all the platform operators can do is show some fucking backbone and stand behind their convictions. Should everyone be platformed? I said earlier that I felt that even the worst ideologies shouldn't be completely erased, as certain truths may disappear along with them, due to the way ideological coalitions work. But when I said that, I was talking in the context of legal speech, and so I don't think a monopolistic power such as the legal apparatus should swoop in and prevent these ideas from being platformed anywhere. However, that doesn't mean that I think that the various entities in society have a duty to platform any particular idea. I don't even see how they could keep up with the sheer number of ideas clamouring for platform space. So I can't come out against deplatforming in an absolutist sense. If some village hall is going to platform a member of NAMBLA to push pro-paedophile propaganda, and then decide not to platform them after some complaints, what right is being violated there? It isn't the right to be able to say things without being arrested or having violence used against you. It's only the apparent right to say things on other people's stages using other people's money. I guess someone could be deplatformed from everywhere and then have no platforms except the hovels they live in, but then that's probably because their ideas aren't popular. So if your goal is to have popular ideas and not just speak to your 5 friends in the wall, then you need to focus on that. If I want my ideas to reach the wider public, and there are SJWs kicking my ideas off certain key platforms and imposing their own orthodoxy, then my complaints should be that their orthodoxy is garbage and based off fantasy, and that my ideas are better. If I want a wide range of access to a wide range of platforms, then I'd better make sure I win the culture war. Of course, part of being popular is appealing to the youth, and today's most censorious faction, the intersectionalist left, has control of the universities. The classical notion of the university is one of prestige, intellectual excellence, and an openness to new ideas and new modes of inquiry.
It is not about creating an intellectual space. It is not. Do you understand that? here!
In reality, it's perhaps better to see the purpose of the university as to complete a system of credentialism and provide training and certification for various career paths. Either way, the university has since the 70s been gradually infested in the West with a variety of new modes of inquiry that themselves wish to close their recipients' minds to others. The university today has a third purpose, and that seems to be ideological training. How else can you explain things like gender studies and post-colonial studies? The only careers these courses could possibly support are ones in teaching the very same courses. Universities were never supposed to become closed and circular in this way. Teachers in many cases are now active participants in organising protests by students, and in deplatforming speakers the administration has platformed, such as in the famous case of Berkeley. Certainly private entities should be free to teach what they want. That is the essence of legal speech doctrine to begin with. However, most of these entities are heavily subsidised by the government, and that is up to the taxpayer and voter. I do believe that public universities should no longer teach such courses, and that subsidies can be withdrawn from private entities that continue to do so. The remaining private universities that receive no public funding can do what they like, but I think you'll find that this will be a fatal blow to the artificially propped up institutional power of social justice. This is why they are so adamantly against such action. In a positive rights interpretation of free speech, this is a violation, but I think we've already shown well enough that the positive rights interpretation cannot be made absolute, as it involves self-detonating contradictions where we need to platform everyone, but certain speech being platformed makes other speech less likely, and there are only so many platforms in the first place. There cannot be a right to be paid by taxpayer money to spread your ideas. Having considered the private sector and the universities, let's look at the big fight of our time, which is the digital fight for space on social media platforms. Ultimately, the government may not censor you, and you may have the theoretical power to say whatever you want somewhere, but you may want to have a somewhere to say it. You can say what you like in your own house, but if you want discourse with others outside of talking face to face, you need to access some kind of communication platform. As we discussed when considering business, the very nature of private property means that these platforms have formal owners and controllers by dint of title. Every business has an owner or owners, and it's the same for every site and speech platform on the internet. This necessarily means that some de facto censorship is not only going to be required, but is paramount. Operation for a specific purpose innately involves some censorship on a positive rights level, by way of exclusion. For example, a fishing forum that wants to keep things on topic must necessarily censor anything that is highly irrelevant to fishing, or at the very least filter it to an off-topic board. Spam is context sensitive and depends on the platform. It is certainly important to preserve freedom of association through platforms and property, and in some sense this necessarily requires at least a kind of censorship. Being against censorship on this level requires envisioning an alternative society in which there are no platforms, differentiation, structure, where the entire internet is a single site that just dumps a ceaseless stream of random but equal content into your face. No, this is not tenable. So once we go beyond the legal realm, we have to be more careful when considering free speech. We can no longer be absolutist or fundamentalist, but we still must address these issues. We must make relative decisions about where the line is to be drawn and in what way. The very biggest communication platforms on the internet are the social media giants, YouTube, Twitter, Google, Snapchat, etc., and these platforms exist purportedly to provide for general purpose communication, but are still subject to the problem of spam or unwanted content and defining it. In some sense, defining these rules is currently up to the private shareholders of the platforms and the CEOs they select, and the administrators they delegate. At least legally, but on a social level the situation is more severe than that. The very nature of the iron law of hierarchy, and the natural emergence of a structure of command in any organisation imaginable in human history, means that even if the government were to provide a similar platform, and even if the government were to claim to be owned by the people, that platform would have representative controllers making the local decisions, and there would over time build up a bureaucracy that is resistant to change. As things are now, companies like Facebook and Discord are engaged in drives to shut down certain political actors, mostly, but not exclusively, on the right. The elites at tech companies went through left-leaning universities and often live in left-leaning places, like California's famous Silicon Valley. A lot of the companies are based there, of course. They're bringing their ideology to the table in deciding what is offensive, what is spam, and so on. Increasingly, of course, they have no choice, because elected governments in Europe are pursuing punitive measures that require these companies to take down material or receive fines. There is also a large swathe of the public that interpret free speech in a very loose way and are eager to see the government crack down on hate speech. So you see, although it is a problem we must tackle, even if you forgo representation and elite control and have some kind of mythical directly democratic platform on the scale of something like Facebook or Twitter, what kinds of rules about speech would the public vote for? And remember that some would inevitably spend more time voting than others, and bots would get involved, and you can imagine the mess. But the point is here, something is going to be defined as verboten. Because while preventing the legal order from censoring is perfectly feasible, as this only requires that anything can be said somewhere, preventing a platform from censoring means that anything can be said in that very specific somewhere. And if it is the largest platform in the world used by all the millions of neurotypical normie Normans worldwide, will they want to be subjected to ideas they consider distasteful? There will be an average taste, and whether market capitalist or socialist democratic or whatever, the platform with millions upon millions using it is going to cater to that taste, and it's going to have rules that wall off distasteful content. This can be anything from random spam, porn, and yes, even ideological propaganda. When you rage against social media censorship, are you asking for a captive audience? When I rage against them, am I asking for that? Social media platforms may benefit from the network effect to become the titans that they are, but they're still vulnerable to their consumers. The network effect simply means that more people use a platform when more people they know are already using it, creating an accelerating growth cycle once a tipping point has been passed. This works in the other direction too, however, and in 2007 the unassailable MySpace stood colossal, until people trickling over to Facebook reached a tipping point that caused a surge in users leaving. Social media oligopolies are a permanent feature, but which companies they will be is something that changes over time. Facebook already seems to be in trouble right now, and it may lose its top spot to a competitor in the near future, even if that takes a decade or so. The different platforms are also somewhat stratified in that platforms like Facebook and Twitter can differ in terms of what they offer through different rules, and it's possible to have anti-network effects when a certain cultural or political tribe is reticent to share a platform with another. On a smaller scale, outside of the social media giants, the differentiation is even more harsh, as between platforms like Tumblr and 4chan. So you have to ask yourself, if social media were to become as uncensored as 4chan or even 8chan's B-board, then what would happen to the average consumer? What would happen is that either the platform would institute some kind of structure whereby people only receive content that they follow and have the ability to block content and users that they don't want to follow, or most of their users would leave for a rival and boost them up to incredible numbers instead when all of their friends' decide to go. It all comes back to culture. Now, what we've seen is that platforms like Twitter do have this kind of internal structure. There's not just a big pit of undifferentiated content. Content is accessed by following and can be avoided by blocking. So even within the somewhere that is a platform like Twitter, there is an extra level of somewheres, different digital islands behind block lists surrounded by a roaring sea of trolls and combatants. Those who want to weather the storm can, and those who want to lock themselves in their clubhouse with their friends also can. The answer to whether social media platforms should censor per se is that if they don't either censor themselves or more effectively delegate censorship capability to internal micro-platforms, then they won't appeal to the majority of people in the first place, and we wouldn't be having this conversation. because these platforms would have never become popular. The problem for anyone who wants to push an ideology on the public, whether it be Sargonite radical liberalistism, alt-rightism, or SJW communism, is that the public themselves want censorship in one form or another. In fact, censorship defined in this way can be the perfectly innocuous act of having a private space. Our major goal should be to increase the number of these spaces so that those who wish to receive content can be separated from those that don't. Of course, the larger problem is when the elites, and unfortunately the public, wish to shut down the private spaces of others, and then we have to confront them, and then we have to tell them things they don't want to hear. If we want to assault these platforms, then we must recognise that we are in some way assaulting the larger public. This is not something I have an especial problem with. It's sincerely the normie problem. When it's not the public's desire, then yes, it can be the curators of the site. Perhaps they have a particular culture that is different from the average person. And on Facebook they have manipulated news feeds to disfavour conservative news. But after a certain number of iterations, it becomes hard to separate what the public wants from what they're influenced to want. The public are ensconced in illiberal manifestations of establishment ideology, and so the issue of how to
catapult the propaganda
concerns those favouring radical liberalism like me, libertarians, and those on the far right, as well as the economic far left who are resistant to being encapsulated in the intersectionalist amoeba. There's no coalition of the fringe, because we're all against each other, but we all have the same issue. The reason we get censored off social media from time to time when we stick our head up or when we piss off the wrong blue check is that our ideas are not popular, or in the best case scenario are not popular among the elite class. And opposing censorship per se does nothing to change that. And as I've shown, it's a largely incoherent self-defeating notion to begin with. You can't build principles on quicksand. We should not attack platforms on the grounds of violating free speech, as if there is some First Amendment equivalent that would apply there, but on the very specific grounds of promoting political bias. We should turn their claims of electoral interference back on them. Facebook should be humiliated and exposed every time it tries to manipulate news feeds. When social media platforms try to manipulate the public, their actions should be highlighted so that the public can adjust their thinking in light of such efforts. We should draw light to all such cases regardless of their political direction, such as the recent Cambridge Analytica scandal, where it has come to light that Facebook allowed the political consulting group to harvest data for the Trump campaign, though most previous scandals to do with political bias have involved anti-conservatism by Facebook feed curators. Now the media cares all of a sudden. If all you want is to make your ideology popular, you need a full-on push to change the culture in order to change what ideas people are willing to tolerate. With a sufficiently strong movement of motivated activists with no lives whatsoever, you can break through the barriers separating communities and influence other people on the fringes of your ideology that might be bridge people to more normal types. It's going to be slow and steady work because of all the barriers in the way, often erected with the consent of those whose attention you want to grab. It would also be good for your cause if more of the people who share your ideology end up working as staff in social media companies. Specific actions by social media and the internet giants such as Google and Amazon that should be opposed include acquisitions outside of their normal purview and efforts to branch out and put their finger in every pot. Unlike on the speech issue, the public is with us radicals here, and it indirectly helps us contain the power of these giants and helps make sure a somewhere doesn't become an everywhere. So this would take the form of using anti-monopoly rulings to do things like preventing Google or Facebook or whichever big digital company from acquiring new companies and becoming even larger. I think that we should also look very carefully at the subsidies these private entities receive. I'm not 100% opposed to trying to make free speech rulings internal to platforms either, but I think this could potentially backfire and lead to greater government control of social media platforms in a time when free speech is not hate speech is a prevalent mode of thought. Similarly, I oppose the calls to nationalise entities like Facebook. I think these entities have a flawed structure, and putting the government directly in control of them solves nothing. People suckered in by the concept of so-called public ownership are convinced that this is the answer, but I am not. I don't want to make something horrible permanent and backed up by taxpayer money. The government also has the same incentives when it chooses to manage things, and any administration that has control of it will try to manipulate news feeds to make the next election easier. No, if the government has to get involved, then I don't want it used as a manager, but merely as a referee, and if necessary, a sword. If the government were to take control of Facebook, I would urge that their very next step be to delete it forever. I would also be very pleased if someone very rich was ballsy enough and committed enough to buy Facebook in order to destroy it, as this April Fool's image implies. I do not think government ownership is the answer to a monopoly, as it will only exacerbate the problem, and the government is not an entity free from profit motives, as is commonly and mistakenly assumed. If social media were fully controlled by the government, this would harm free communication far more than the government-linked megacorporate oligopolies have already done. We would go full China at that point, and China is further down the road towards a technological dystopia than we are, so we should view their efforts as a cautionary tale, and not an encouragement. In any case, the cultural battle to restore legal free speech should go side by side with a bias towards open inquiry. If you win that battle, the public and the government is more likely to be of a kind to no longer desire slanted ideological suppression in social media. Also, outside of the issue of social media platforms is the very much larger issue of the internet as a platform itself. Although we are going to have very great difficulty reaching the public on social media, we at least have our own spaces and home bases on other sites, and even if we get banned, there are sites like Discord where servers can be made, or 8chan where boards can be made and where plans of action can be formulated by those who are actually invested. We still have our own little somewhere on the internet. If you get a scenario where either ISPs or the government decide otherwise, then we could lose that. When you expand the scenario to the internet itself, then I think clear differentiations can be made that are hard to make on the level of individual sites. The internet is a platform that only exists to facilitate the existence of other platforms. It has no other purpose. Here we can stake out a space for a much more fundamentalist free speech that exists in addition to the traditional notion of the absence of government censorship. We can say that the internet itself should not be censored, even if sites within it have to be internally moderated to fit the fulfillment of their goals. This is why, although I've seen some good arguments the other way, I now lean towards support for some kind of net neutrality rules, though the danger of the government running the internet is still there. Also, legislation that aims to make websites responsible for their users' content and turn them into the equivalent of media outlets rather than platforms should be fought against. This would have an internet-wide effect and chill the freedom to associate, and you'd have to somehow find a platform that is willing to eat the liabilities. All this having now been established, I think we are getting closer to an extra-legal guideline on free speech. Ultimately, censorship exists wherever there is freedom of association, because its operation necessarily requires the freedom to disassociate, and disassociation necessarily means exclusion, which is de facto censorship from a particular platform or property. This only becomes a problem when the platform operates on such a scale that certain ideas become largely excluded from society altogether. Otherwise, it is of benefit. Therefore, the guideline for this issue should be to fight against the largest entities in society and disrupt their power to censor, while simultaneously freeing up the power of smaller entities to de facto censor through the right to associate. This will be difficult to balance, and there can be no absolutist principle here as there's no absolute definition of a large entity and a small one, but it shouldn't be thought of in the same way as the legal principle of speech. It exists outside of something as formal as laws, and exists as a guideline for cultural pushback against the worst excesses of monopoly power. The very pinnacle of that power is of course the government, and so the primary and overwhelming sense of freedom of speech should be that formal legal sense, and in fighting a culture war we must be careful not to muddle that point, even if we cannot leave the grey areas totally unaddressed. It's incumbent upon us to develop scepticism of large entities, even as they are required for society to function. We should provide for freedom of association right up to the point where we need to push back against monopolies in general. This requires a balance that can't be mathematically formulated in a universal way, but only experimentally discovered. Tread carefully, but tread nonetheless. We can now list some guidelines for a coherent pro-free speech agenda. 1. Legal speech fundamentalism must be the absolute primary understanding of free speech, the coherent principle and solid bedrock for other notions of the concept to plant their foundations upon. 2. More legal freedom for small private entities to freely associate. At the very least, less social freedom for the very most gigantic entities, if not an extension of the legal principle in the cases which come very closest to representing a monopolistic platform, such as the Internet as a whole itself. 3. Expose political bias by social media operators, turn their notion of fake news and electoral disruption back on them, and counter calls for removing certain ideas with individual choice. Block lists already exist, and user-tailored feeds already exist and are part of these platforms. We should use the fact that these exist as an argument against platform-wide exclusion. 4. More social pressure against deplatforming intimidation. The choice to platform or not is preserved, but we should watch out for people going back on their decision due to mobs, and we should find and shame these mobs, and if of course they do use violence, they're exposed to the response of the law. 5. Withdrawal of public funding from controversial sociological ideas that cannot be justified on the grounds of productive continuity, while allowing them their associative freedom in the private sector. 6. Don't throw the term free speech around if you aren't willing to define it, as it has become immensely muddled. And don't call yourself a free speech fundamentalist or absolutist unless you are talking about the negative rights First Amendment sense of free speech, where the government can absolutely refrain from doing something, whether to its detriment or otherwise. But a positive rights interpretation cannot be maximised, since it would require that the government and the private sector give you a platform wherever and whenever, which is a physically impossible task. Calling for absolutism on something you can only define vaguely will only lead to contradictions, and this will lead to you losing your credibility. 7. Accept that some ideas are going to be unpopular, and that's probably a good thing. And there can be no right to be popular, only a fight to be popular that should be available for all ideas. If the social media platforms are themselves unable to censor, then that will be delegated downwards to the users, and declaring you have a right to other people's attention is a fairly meaningless statement. You have the right to try and get attention, but that process is a fight, and it may well involve breaking through barriers and showing people things they didn't want to see. But whether they then choose to put up those barriers again and tune themselves out will be determined by how convincing your argument really is. Declaring anything else is just the whinging of history's losers.